I'm running from the den I've been. I'm running just as fast as I can. I got my scarlet letter in hand. I got to flee the promised land. But they say that letter's a pander, 'cause it comes from a salamander, accusing me of slander. The members of the den-eyed band. But I thought they were going to pay me just to lock the letter away, so that no one else could see. But they soon found out about me, how I'd done this rank forgery, and now they're out searching for me, and they're accusing me of slander. The members of the den-eyed band. With the Salamander Letter, the story just gets better. But with that old angel Maroney, it seems so moronic and phony. And if the top found out about me, I'd be rich without a doubt. Now they're accusing me of slander, the members of the den-eyed band.
Let's start from from the beginning here. Why don't you tell me how you met Mark Hofmann to start with, and then we could probably jump forward a bunch of years to how you got involved in this, catching the forgery.
I out of an old hippie 60s head shop called the Cosmic Aeroplane, I created a bookstore, and three of us moved it on to First South and opened it up in 1976. Cosmic Airplane Books and Records was on old First South Film Row next to the old Blue Mouse Theater. Those were some wonder years. The Cinegrill restaurant was just up the street. And one day, some just punk baby-faced kid walked in the door, started trying to wheel and deal. And he was a really arrogant puke, trying to wheel and deal all these Mormon and Western documents to me. I know hindsight's easy, okay? I didn't like him. He didn't like me. He left. I didn't do business with him. And I would come to find out that his name was Mark Hofmann, and he touched back in those days virtually every single person that ever had anything to do with rare Mormonism and Mormon collecting, Western collecting. What we've got to remember here, Keith, yes, he pulled off some spectacular Mormon forgeries like the Salamander Letter, But he did Emily Dickinson poems, The Oath of a Freeman, the oldest recorded broadside in the history of printing in America. Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Mark Twain, Betsy Ross, Herman Melville. He did it all. And we've only ever uncovered a fraction of his forgeries to this day. He simply put was not just the Mormon forger.
So I to help me understand this, so I grew up LDS, not in Utah, but I was familiar with a lot of these stories. But I did look at a 2005 Deseret News article to kind of prepare myself for this interview. And at that time, you were on a national committee for authentic pieces. Do you remember this organization you used to be involved in?
Well, I still am. It's the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. It's the only professional of book dealers association in this country. We have international affiliates through iLab as well. I became the security chair. This wasn't until after Hofmann had been exposed, but we are still to this day, and this was maybe 20 years after the original bombings and forgeries. We're still all being victims of Mark Hofmann today. And by that, first and foremost, the families of the people that he killed, the people their families, I mean, they're the ultimate victims, but his own former wife, Dory, and her family, they're victims. Every single person from Al Russ to Brent Ashworth to everyone else, through their belief in fellow Mormonism, through their faith and belief in Mormonism, right up to the elders of the LDS Church, they're all victims of Mark Hofmann. Some of them lost family members, some of them lost faith, some of them probably blessedly only lost enormous quantities of money. For people like Al Trust, the betrayal of the faith was the worst betrayal for a man like that.
So why don't you tell me, what do you mean by the betrayal of the faith? Maybe give us a little snippet of, especially like the Salamander Letters, I think is the most well-known, but if you could like briefly, if that's possible, kind of tell us what those were all about and how the LDS Church reacted to them when they first emerged.
Well, it's so complicated. In essence, every collector weirdly was innocently a co-conspirator of Mark Hofmann. And what I mean by that is a postal history collector would say, gosh, I've never ever seen a postmark from the BY, aka Brigham Young Express Company, a local short-lived Mormon version of the Pony Express. To this day, no one's ever found a postmark. They would say, oh my gosh, of all the ZCMI, the cooperative stores that the Mormons created throughout the 1850s and 60s, I've never seen, a $2 script from the so-and-so co-op from Scipio. I'm making this up because I don't remember the details. And on and on. Gosh, I wished I could find, and this was like they were giving him orders for what he would forge next. But in the larger sense, Keith, Mark Hofmann was a Mormon missionary. He went on his mission. I'm not his shrink. I don't know what happened, but he became an un-Mormon pretty quickly, and he didn't tell anybody. And his vendetta, if you will, he set out in his youthful arrogance, that got worse, by the way, over time, to destroy the Mormon Church. He set out to create forged documents that would be embarrassing to the LDS Church, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to the Mormons. He set out to create documents that would prove the authenticity of he would forge documents to prove the authenticity of his forged documents. There was a clever streak in him. There's no question about it. He created examples of handwriting of Martin Harris, who it didn't exist before Mark Hofmann forged it. So when his ultimate goal was to create the 116 pages of the lost book of the Book of Mormon, it would be in Martin Harris's hand, and all his previous forgeries that he had forged in Harris's hand would be the standard to which the 116 pages would be held up to. He when he wanted to be, he was probably as good as any forger we know about. But the thing you got to realize about forgers, if they're really, really good, we don't know who they are because they've never been caught.
That's crazy. So why don't you tell me, did you ever, in that same Deseret News article that I looked at, it basically,
Yes.
it referred to something that you had an interaction with, where there was something that was a Mark Hofmann piece and you put a bid on it, and then you realized, oh my gosh, this was in this authentic.
It was an auction back east. I foolishly, stupidly, I was bidding. It's a Joseph Smith, and you put me on the spot, and this is so many decades ago. It was a favorite saying of Joseph Smith, something about truth and bringing us together. I'm not going to be able to bring it up. Oh, that's just great. So I won it. And then somebody who said, that's a Mark Hofmann, right? I said, what? What are you talking about? I called the auction company up. Oh boy, howdy. You don't, never mind. You don't have to buy it. That's okay. That's okay. It was a hot potato.
They didn't want it connected to them as selling a Mark Hofmann.
No, they didn't. Now, ironically, I have sold any number of Mark Hofmann, some of his best ones. Now, to be clear, as Mark Hofmann forgeries, okay? I sold, for example, here's his genius and his stupidity. Here's Mark Hofmann's genius and stupidity in one short story. Betsy Ross, the famous American seamstress that allegedly, sewed together the American flag. Well, guess what? No one's ever seen an autograph by Betsy Ross. Likely, like many colonial Americans, she couldn't read or write, didn't know how to sign her name. Hofmann comes up with one. And here's the genius part. All he did was take a letter from around 1812, 1814. It was signed Betsy, right? So the paper's authentic, the ink's authentic, the time period's authentic. Every single thing is totally authentic, except he added ROSS to the Betsy. So there's his genius, but he didn't do his research. Betsy Ross, the famous American seamstress, was married 5 times. In the year of that letter, 1812, she had not yet met or married Ross. So he screwed up.
Yeah, that's a big screw up. So why don't you tell us when all this stuff, when it started coming out, when people started realizing that he was a forger, what was it like back then when it all started taking place, especially with you who deals with these type of authentic and antique documents?
With hindsight, it should have been easy. Here's this wonder kid, so wet behind the ears, and almost every day he is finding a holy grail treasure that those of us that are legitimately in the trade might happen to us once in a lifetime. And he's turning them up like clockwork. That should have been a tell. An awful lot of it, and I'm not trying to point any fingers here, but any of us, all of us, should have caught that. Perhaps greed got in the way. Perhaps because he was really up to trying to embarrass the LDS Church. Rick Turley accounts in his book Victims, the LDS Church's side of these things. I'm sure that will be well represented in this documentary as well. But it sure seems to a Gentile like me that they were a little too eager to buy up embarrassing things about the church and hide them away. I'll leave it at that. you can argue the point, and I'll concede the argument.
Well, that's the very first argument that I ever heard about them, is that that's exactly what happened.
And my point of view. But sorry, so I'm wandering. So what was the question?
No, you're good. Just what you had just said about when it started coming out that he was a forger. You're saying that, people should have recognized it. But what was it like when you actually did find out, when you said, oh my God, this guy is a forger?
Well, no one believed it. No one believed it when the bombs went off. The headlines in the papers and the media then were, comparing Salt Lake City to Beirut, Lebanon. When the bombs started going off, people were defending him. Mark Hofmann was the third victim of the mad bomber, his close friends. That's how well he duped everybody through what we today call affinity fraud. My brother so-and-so, we're in the same ward together. Let me show you this fabulous thing I found, maybe you could, buy it and donate it to the church. He was a master at affinity fraud. And he, though, if you look at his whole body of forgeries, he was as good as he needed to be to fool the particular mark at that time and that place. A lot of his forgeries don't hold up well. He forged it was a beautiful copy in a dust jacket of Jack London's Call of the Wild, his most famous book. He, at Debussy's engraving, just a few doors down from the Cosmic Airplane, I might add, he went in and made a metal plate up that branded the book as ownership. And I'm going to forget his name because of the years, but the star of Call of the Wild is the dog, right? His name is Buck. So this would be the ultimate copy any collector would kill for, sorry for the bad pun, to have in his collection. This is the very copy, allegedly, that Jack London inscribed to Buck's owner. That, if it had been real, that's the copy you want in your collection. And that's what he was a master at doing.
So he was good at figuring out what people wanted and then creating what they wanted.
Or create a document also forged that would authenticate the forgery, like written by Emily Dickinson's father, or, a famous person's. He plants the seed of there being the document in his first forgery. Then in forgery number 2, he creates the document that his previous forgery authenticates.
So why don't we finish off just kind of with a little bit of a timeline when everything starts kind of falling apart for Hofmann? And I'd say, why don't you tell me about when the very first bombing, tell me about, there was 3 bombings, I think. If you could just kind of talk about what happened during that time period that you can remember.
Salt Lake City in the summer of 1985 was shell-shocked. It was upset. It was discombobulated. People had no idea who to trust, anything. He blew up. He left a package at a residential home that blew up. The wife, when she bent over and picked it up, he left a package in the Judge building that, again, the gentleman opens it up. I'm not deliberately not mentioning names. And blows himself to kingdom come, all in an elaborate ruse to throw the scent off to financial fraud or some such thing that wouldn't tie to him. And allegedly, the third package, he was getting out of the trunk of his car. He was allegedly on his way to meet the famous Mormon collector Brent Ashworth in Provo. Brent has gone public with this many times, so he wouldn't be offended by my using his name. And allegedly, that third bomb that Hofmann blew himself up with was intended for Brent Ashworth.
So let me finish with this last question then. Why don't you tell us what is it something that people in Utah should be able to learn from revisiting this? What's the importance of revisiting this story, this part of history in Utah?
Mark Hofmann didn't invent forgery. There have been forgers before and after Mark Hofmann. Mark Hofmann lived and forged during a time that we'll refer to as pre-internet, pre-digital. The opportunities, the technology we have now enables one to almost replicate everything from, I understand, a ribeye steak, you ain't gonna catch me eating one of those, to ancient Chinese vases, to maybe an entire 1830 Book of Mormon. Who knows? You cannot be too careful. You need to not trust your own instincts. You need to get second and third opinions, and you need to have provenance. How did this thing come to be? Where was it? Like, even now, if I look at something that I think might be in a Hofmann realm and I can't get the provenance back, say, before 1975, I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to assume Mark Hofmann did it. And how would you believe if Mark Hofmann told you he forged it? Would you believe him? If he told you he didn't forge it, would you believe him?
I don't know, but Ken, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point? Anything I should have asked about that you'd like to add?
I think don't take it on faith. You know, do your own diligence, do your own research. There's a disbelief among collectors sometimes that they want to believe they have these real autographs of the Beatles, and any attempts on your part to convince them otherwise makes you the bad guy. They want to believe the fallacy. I'll never understand it, but you can't be too careful, especially with documents, autographs.
All right. Thanks for your time, Ken. I appreciate it.
Antique documents worth millions. Techniques that fool America's greatest experts. A master plan so profound it takes years to unfold. And a brilliant mind driven to the absolute edge. 1980, Salt Lake City, Utah. Home of the Mormon Church and setting for a discovery that sends shockwaves throughout America. Mark Hofmann, a first-year medical student, has purchased an old Bible. Stuck between its pages is a mysterious document. Unable to see what it is and unable to safely remove it, Hofmann calls on an expert to help him. He watches on as Professor Jess Simmons, curator of the University Archives, unearths the long-lost Anthon transcript.
And this was a document with strange characters on it that purportedly was produced by Joseph Smith as copies of the characters that came from the gold plates that he translated the Book of Mormon on. So you can see this would be an astounding document. They decided this was a real authentic Joseph Smith document.
All of a sudden, he was the young man that came up with one of the great historical finds of Mormon history.
To the Mormon community, the Anthon transcript is the Word of God revealed to them through the hand of their founder, Joseph Smith. Hofmann sells his amazing find to the Mormon Church for $20,000. Hofmann becomes a star. His status in the Mormon community skyrockets. Church leaders eager to promote Mormon history embrace him. He quits medical school to search for documents full-time. 6 months later, Hofmann makes another incredible find. He unearths 3 Joseph Smith letters that he sells for $95,000. The money pours in. When Hofmann offers to give lectures on his many finds, Mormons line up to learn more about their faith.
I actually remember attending a seminar where Mr. Hofmann spoke about one of his discoveries, and I found it quite fascinating.
He uses these occasions to build relationships with wealthy collectors who compete to buy documents from him.
He would come to see us fairly frequently. He would bring material to sell or trade, and he did it on a regular basis so that you began to count on it.
Obviously, he was coming up with some remarkable finds, and he seemed to be the gatekeeper to the document.
Hofmann tells dealers his amazing success is the result of years of research.
He even hired part-time genealogists to track down descendants of famous Mormon leaders so that he could approach the families and buy documents from them.
Over the next year, Hofmann makes more apparent discoveries, including documents of national importance from the hands of Daniel Boone, Abe Lincoln, George Washington, and Jack London. His fame spreads. The Mormon Church believes he is touched by God.
He certainly had more access to the church historical department. It seemed like they fell all over themselves to allow him to see whatever he wanted to see. He was quite a celebrity at that point.
But what they don't know is, Hofmann is using his celebrity to secretly learn the names, dates, and handwriting styles on the church's most sensitive documents. Information he will use to create the world's most astounding series of forgeries. Because Mark Hofmann is a fraud, and so is everything he sells. Starting at 15 years of age, when he fooled the U.S. Treasury with a fake antique coin, he has created over 600 extraordinary forgeries, including the Anthon transcript, the Joseph Smith letters, and materials by hundreds of famous Americans, all of which deceive the world's most discerning experts and net him millions. But what techniques is he using to fool the world's most respected experts? The paper for Hofmann's forgeries will have to be at least 150 years old. But you can't just get something this rare off the shelf. Or can you? When no one's looking, he helps himself to the blank pages in the backs of old library books. Finding old ink, however, is a lot more difficult.
He had found an old recipe for some ink, how it was made in the 1830s. He was able to make that ink by following this formula.
Hofmann grinds oak nuts and wasp larvae, adds it to ferrous sulfate, then a dash of gum arabic, and finally water. He agitates the light brown mixture until it transforms into a rich dark black. Perfect period ink, right? Foolproof. Wrong. And Hofmann knew it.
He went one step further. He knew that probably there would be a carbon-14 dating of the ink that was used on the document. Because remember, this was going to be a very, very important national document. And so he said, how am I going to counter that? Well, he tore up pieces of that paper that he ripped off down at Brigham Young University and burned it so that it was now carbonized, and mixed that in the ink that he used.
This brilliantly ensures that the ink will now date from the 1800s. But to a master forger, the most difficult hurdle is making the ink look 150 years old.
There's many different ways you can artificially age a document. You can do it through treating it with oxygen, through treating it with heat, through treating it with certain chemicals. Hofmann used all of these.
Hofmann soaks the document in a chemical bath of ammonia, the same substance used to clean windows. This has the effect of turning the black ink to a convincing faded brown. And how could he give it a perfect aged yellow color? He uses a household iron. What makes Hofmann's forgeries so convincing is their historical accuracy, the way they perfectly capture both the language and handwriting style of the period. But they're also convincing for another reason. Long before he offers forgeries for sale, he's devised an ingenious ploy.
He donated many documents to the libraries, to the LDS Church at no charge, and then later on would come back with quite a controversial document and maybe charge him $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. As they would seek to authenticate the document, the first thing they would look at was the writing. Well, they would be comparing the writing that Mark Hofmann forged to writing in their archives, and that writing was donated by Mark Hofmann, and that was also forged. So in fact, they were comparing forged writing to forged writing. And this was the downfall of many of the laboratories, including the FBI.
But forgery isn't just about technique. It's also about psychology.
He never wanted to find a document himself. He always had somebody else do it for him. That way the suspicion would never be on him.
That was exactly what happened when Hofmann allowed the professor to discover the Anthon transcript.
As you look back on that, it was a piece of brilliance on Hofmann's part, have someone of that caliber, discover that, quote unquote, in his presence, and then for Mark to act so surprised and, like the rest of them, at what they'd found.
But Hofmann's forgery goes deeper. He creates a false history for the Bible that ties it to Joseph Smith.
Hofmann claimed that he had bought a really old Bible back in Carthage, Illinois, where Joseph Smith had been killed, and he claimed that he had bought this from the descendants of Joseph Smith.
Then, to put the finishing touch to his masterful con, he perfectly forges Smith's signature in the Bible.
He had this ability to understand what people wanted, and he was able to deliver it. And when someone delivers what you really want, you're not as a skeptic about it.
Hofmann's documents are so convincing that Brent Ashworth spent $300,000 on them. One of Hofmann's most successful techniques to avoid detection is to never tell one buyer what he's selling to another.
Had we been able to get together and discuss different transactions and things he had said, we could have uncovered the deception.
2 years after selling the Anthon, Hofmann ups the ante, realizing the church will pay a fortune to protect the image of its founder, Joseph Smith. He creates the Salamander Letter, the first in a series of controversial documents that threatens the very foundation of the Mormon faith.
This was a letter that was written by Martin Harris, who was a close friend of Joseph Smith. So it gave the impression that Joseph Smith was kind of a charlatan, practicing in black magic and things like that. It was kind of an embarrassment to the church.
People didn't want to see those documents come to light to protect the church. People wanted to use these documents to expose the church. You have people pulling those documents different ways to use them for their own purposes. That drove up the price. That drove up his status. That made his persona in Salt Lake City.
Hofmann now travels east, craving the thrill of bigger prey. But he knows he'll need a new technique for dealing with such sophisticated experts. He creates an entirely new persona for himself.
He became acquainted with two very sophisticated book merchants back east. I mean, these were guys that were really into the trade, and it was interesting. They kind of looked at Mark Hofmann as kind of a pigeon. He had actually bought books from them at inflated prices. And so they looked upon Hofmann as just this little bumpkin from Utah that they could kind of lead around.
And he made those people think that they were smarter than they were. And he made those people think that he was dumber than they were. And as soon as they thought they were pulling one over on Mark Hofmann, that they were pulling one over on this country bumpkin from Utah, he had them hooked.
Hofmann uses these East Coast dealers to launch his boldest forgery yet. A document that will literally rewrite American history.
The Oath of a Freeman was supposed to be the very first document that was ever printed in the colonies.
And many people thought it was the precursor to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
To create it, Hofmann now masters a completely new technique.
This is a printed document rather than a handwritten document.
Hofmann poses as an innocent history buff and cons a commercial engraver into creating a zinc printing plate.
At the bottom of this is a little disclaimer. This is a replica of the Oath of a Freeman. But when he was ready to use it, he would cut off the bottom portion of this, run some ink that he had made through using his own chemical composition, and then find a piece of paper, place the plate on top of the paper, and by exerting pressure on it, he would then have a document which we now call the Oath of a Freeman.
People believed it was out there, and so he created the document. He filled the hole. And now the scholars are ecstatic because it proves their idea or their theory that the document existed.
This had been authenticated by the FBI, the Library of Congress, the American Antiquarian Society, the McCrone Institute, the University of California, and 2 other independent labs. Every one of them said this was a genuine document.
The Library of Congress tells Hofmann it is seeking authorization for his asking price of $1.5 million. He has reached the pinnacle of the forger's art. But 9 years of criminal activity have changed Hofmann's character.
He started staying in very nice hotels, flew first class. He started buying things. He put down money on a big new house.
Hofmann at that time was getting caught up in the lifestyle. And sometimes crooks begin to believe that what is deception is actual reality.
The mild-mannered Utah bumpkin starts acting like a Wild West gangster, racing his new car into the desert to shoot his Uzi submachine gun. But this bold new lifestyle is about to bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. For the last 9 years, Mark Hofmann has been conning the experts with his perfect forgeries. But his extravagant new lifestyle is a real problem. He owes a fortune.
Like a lot of con men who get involved in these kinds of things, they go through money. They don't make a lot of money, they go through money.
Obviously, there were several deals that weren't working out for him. He was trying to sell that Oath of a Freeman to the Library of Congress.
Demanding more time to test the oath, the Library of Congress refuses to pay Hofmann. He is now so desperate for cash, he decides to forge an entire collection of letters, diaries, and affidavits written by William McClellan, a bitter critic of Joseph Smith.
This was a collection that was supposedly coming out of Texas that would have been very detrimental to the image of the church. Hofmann was promising to produce it.
He conned Steve Christensen, a representative of the church, into fronting him hundreds of thousands of dollars. So now Hofmann's got money, but what he doesn't have is time.
If it was 1 or 2 documents, he could sit down at night and put it together. But if it's hundreds of documents, there's no way he had the time to put that type of collection together.
He didn't produce the collection like he was supposed to. There was a lot of pressure to produce that because a lot of money was tied up in it.
As Hofmann struggles to complete the collection, he sinks deeper into debt and is forced to borrow more money.
Mark came into my store to try to raise money and was very distraught, visibly shaken, pale. I'd never seen him like that.
He would have been under tremendous pressure. There were certain people that were after him for money.
And it isn't long before some of his disgruntled investors get ugly.
He was trying to juggle a whole lot of balls in the air, and at one moment, I think those balls came down, and that's when he became desperate.
Hofmann is now over $1 million in debt. All his brilliant forging skills can't help him. He panics and resorts to violence.
A pipe bomb concealed in a package addressed to Stephen Christensen explodes outside Christensen's office in downtown Salt Lake. Christensen dies in a hail of shrapnel.
Hofmann targets Christensen because he was about to expose Hofmann's financial dealings.
11:20 a.m., another pipe bomb explodes in suburban Holiday.
The second bomb was intended for Christensen's business partner, but mistakenly kills an innocent bystander. Hofmann then builds a third bomb.
There's a lot of speculation as to who the third bomb was for. I think the bomb was intended for Brent Ashworth. They had met on that day of the week for a long period of time. Brent was expected to be at that location, and I really think that Mark had planned to go to that location and set that bomb off in the vicinity of Brent Ashworth.
We would have just walked up to his car like we normally did, and he'd invite me to get in the car, and whammo, I probably would have been killed.
But Brent Ashworth didn't come to town. So now Hofmann has a live bomb sitting on his seat.
October 16th, 2:40 p.m. A third bomb explodes in the sports car of historic documents dealer Mark Hofmann.
Hofmann suffers burns and multiple fractures.
His injuries were not life-threatening, but they were very serious.
Mark Hofmann is lucky to be alive, but his account of the explosion that injured him has made the authorities suspicious.
Well, we decided we had to do a very concerted, extremely in-depth investigation of Mark Hofmann and all of his document dealings.
As investigators circle closer to Hofmann as their killer, the case throws a cloud of doubt on the church's documents and on others Hofmann has sold from coast to coast.
Once we learned that they were forgeries, once we learned that his whole reputation was built up on deceit, we understood why he killed these two people.
Finally, prosecutors make their move.
Mark W. Hofmann has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, a capital offense.
Hofmann pleads guilty to second-degree murder and theft by deception. In January 1988, he appears in court to face sentencing.
Do you think you should ever be free again?
Obviously, I want to be free. By a majority vote, the board has decided that you should serve natural life in prison.
I've never met a person that was so amoral. Everything was about him, about his ability to fool people. His great desire in life was to fool the experts. That's what everything was pointed toward, creating a document and daring the experts to disprove it. And that's what drove him on.
He admitted later that he actually was trying to change church history, because he said that he had become an atheist when he was a teenager. He wanted to embarrass the church. He wanted to show that it was false. He wanted to literally change history. But he did it in such a genius way that it was all very plausible.
After 10 years, 800 documents, and 2 murders, the master forger's reign has finally come to an end.